Hi everyone, and welcome to my talk. What's the worst that could happen? Let's talk risky business. I'm Olga Vassilieva. I'm the finance manager at League of Geeks, fondly known as LOG. We are an independent game development studio in Melbourne. In a past life, I worked for the Australian Olympic swim team, and I have now been in the games industry with League of Geeks for 2 years. As part of the business team, I provide some of the frameworks and systems that support our growth and the success of our studio. I'll cover some of these today. A big part of what I do as part of my role is anticipating consequences to business decisions that are being made and thinking of the worst case scenarios, things that can go wrong generally, so that we can take steps to avoid them. I like to think that I'm acting as a sort of voice of reason in an environment that's used to moving fast, taking risks, and dealing with the consequences down the track. So what's this risky business? As an industry, we are incredibly innovative. We want to focus on the craft, the art, the technology, but we're also exposed to a huge amount of change and unknowns. And this is what makes a business risky, because we can prepare for things we don't know. And while we're used to rolling with the punches, if we can identify the events that could throw a project off course, we can also take action and safeguard ourselves and increase the likelihood of our success. Especially now in the environment that we're in, where we're probably reinventing the way that we work and the way that we connect, it's important to keep asking questions about what we're trying to achieve, what's important to us, and what is standing in our way. So I'm really looking to show you an easy framework to managing your risk and systems to think about your exposure that are always going to be applicable no matter your size, your situation, or your goals. And I'll be using examples of what we've done at League of Geeks throughout. So whether you're a team of 2 or 20, I'm hoping that you can walk away with some tools that you can use straight away. So firstly, when I talk about a risk management framework, this is really a group of systems and questions we ask each other to deal with things that could go wrong. At a high level, we're understanding our goals, we're identifying what can go wrong, we are anticipating the impact and the consequences on the project if those events were to happen. We get response plans in place, and we're ensuring that those plans are aligned to handle the risk on an ongoing basis. So that framework is going to start making sense as I'm going through. So using this framework, I'm going to start talking to you about how we've managed the risk and the change at LOG, specifically looking at a few different categories like external risk, project risk, operations and strategy, and finance risk. First things first, external risk. So I refer to this as all the external factors that are affecting the games industry but are out of your control. So this is associated with things like regulations around loot boxes, the changing and new privacy laws like the GDPR, the shift to free play or the change to subscription services, the changing landscape in consoles and mobile development, the chance of an economic downturn, and more visibly in something that's going to be maybe relatable to everyone, the current pandemic. So most of us have been impacted, if not by having to work from home, then by losing those networking and funding opportunities. Or if you're based in Melbourne, you've been in stage 4 restrictions. So internally, this is how we have planned to manage some of the chaos and how that fits within the risk framework. So first step was to look at our goals. In very simplistic terms, we are in the midst of developing a new MP, so our goal is making the game. Throughout, I'll also encourage you to think more thoroughly about your objectives, but I'll cover that later on. So we're faced with the risk of disruption on a project due to the global pandemic. First step after knowing what you're facing is to identify the impact this is going to have. So this is where we got a leadership team together to brainstorm on the consequences of having to work from home for an extended period of time. So at this stage, you want to get a good variety of stakeholders with multiple viewpoints. For this particular risk, the impacts would be quite widespread across the production, the people, the culture, and the work standards. So we had the full leadership team contributing. And we asked ourselves a series of questions around how development is going to be impacted, how the teams are going to be impacted, how collaboration is going to be impacted. And there's a lot of consequences to this global pandemic. I mean, a lot. We're seeing slowing down in development, we're seeing disconnected teams, we're exposed to data losses because we're not working internally in the studio. There's a sense of lost sense of belonging. We're also reinventing the working practices that we have. There's just a constant need to adapt and a million new normals. Wow, that's a lot. And that's not something that's going to be solved in one sitting with a spreadsheet or a risk register. But just sitting down with your team and having a discussion around risk and talking about your blind spots and just identifying what risk is going to come up can often more than enough help you start putting plans in place to control those risks. So that identification is only the first step. Then we start formulating the plans and the structures and processes that we need to put in place in order to reduce that impact. With the idea that you don't need to keep coming together to reevaluate those in the short term unless something changes. As an example, some of the things that we've done to reduce some of that impact of the disruption is setting up processes and policies for working from home so that people can stay productive. We're making sure that people are equipped with everything they need to work from home for at least 6 months. We're also making sure to have regular engagement of teams through Slack and Zoom. Making sure everyone is clear on how to secure the data. And we also knew that we would need to be conscientious of the mental health impact this will have on people. So we're making sure to check in and encourage flexible work and mental health leave. After this identification of problems and determining ways to treat them, we also identified how we would be managing the communication with our teams if we needed any updates or changes. So initially, we needed to check in every week, and then actually, as time progressed, it's probably less frequent now. But something that our founders agreed early on is that in terms of certainty, we need to act with certainty. So with all that work being done back in March, when we're still in the studio, so 6 months down the track, we've had to keep looking at that risk management process, keep the communication open with the teams, and always having to reassess the situation and making sure that what we've got in place is still applicable, whether the communication is still working, whether there's any small adjustments that we need to make sure that people's mental health are kept well. And of course, plans change a lot. So we needed to have that continuous review and changing of plans. Cool. So summarize some of the takeaways from this process. Understand the environment you operate in. So that could be around the regulations, the trend, global development, and think about how this can be a threat to your project. Get the right people involved. So your leadership team or your stakeholders, and this is also an opportunity to keep talking to your fellow developers, keep connecting and see how others are handling the hurdles. So this is where something like the GCAP is a great tool, and there's lots of other ways to connect with the industry. Then you formulate a plan for those risks. whether that's just changing the way that you work in Slack, or you may need to implement some changes to fit with global regulations. And keep reviewing and monitoring what's going on around you, and if you need to adjust some of those plans. And that cycle continues, and it's a living process throughout. Cool. Project risk. So risk management is not a term that we use internally outside of the strict studio risk register that we have. But in fact, project management is risk management. So when we're managing project risk, the first step is to understand our objectives. So at Log, for example, at a high level, we have the critical, cultural, and commercial success of a game as an objectives. We're also reaching for a certain quality, a certain style, and a certain audience. So any action we take from here needs to take this into consideration. And we'll also have the short-term goals that are directed by the milestones and the sprints, but we're always planning with the end in mind, so we're not forgetting what we want to achieve as an end product. So when you think about your own objectives, think about what separates you from other studios, or think of the strengths of your culture and your values and your project. So that while you might be dealing with the risks that are tied to small tasks, you're not forgetting what you're really here for, which is to deliver an entire project. So you need to be able to step back and see the forest from the trees. Next, think of what could go wrong. So what could go wrong when you're trying to achieve those goals, and how your project may be at risk. Same as with my last example, get your teams together and your stakeholders and brainstorm on this. So use some questions as a prompt to get that conversation going. Some of the questions could be, what did we learn from a past project? Do we lack a particular skill on this project? What does a publisher need to feel good about what we're doing? How could something disrupt our operations? What activities are the most complex? So that could give you a very good indication of where things could go wrong. Next, we'll look at the tools, the systems, and the processes we can put in place to control and monitor those risks. So these are some systems that we have internally. I've got business cases, alignment weeks, retros, sit reps, and stand-ups. So creating a business case, very simply, is knowing where you are today and where you want to go and connecting those two dots. So this makes sure that the solution that you want to go with, so whether that's a new software or whether you need to roll out an update or whether you need to get a new piece of equipment, is actually going to serve the purpose that you want it to. So for example, if you're looking for a new piece of software to do your animation, you might be reaching out to your arts team to see what tools they prefer to work with. And you might ask them their views on what worked best given your project in particular. And you will probably be checking in with your engineers as well to make sure that this solution will actually work with the pipelines that you have in place. And you'll consider what other solutions are out there and why those solutions wouldn't work as well or better than what you're considering. Of course, you're always looking at the cost, whether the cost is going to be something that you're willing to invest in, how quickly this needs to be rolled out, but also the uptake of how long it's going to take your team to actually use it at its full potential. And then again, think of the things that could go wrong. So are there going to be some unintended consequences? Is everyone on the team willing to learn a new system and capable of learning a new system in conjunction with probably other things that you have going on? Is this new tool compatible with other systems that you have in place? And of course, if this is not implemented, what's going to be the impacts on your project? And this doesn't need to be a time-consuming process. You just want to make sure that you've asked yourself some questions about what you're trying to achieve and sanity checking that the solution that you found is actually going to get you there. Then you've got alignment weeks, which is something that happens roughly every 6 weeks. So this is where teams of mixed disciplines come together to discuss the project milestone. So we're reviewing the work that was done in the past 6 weeks and discuss what we want to achieve, what's possible to achieve in the next sprint. So this is also a chance to discuss problems and issues we've had and how we're going to get over them. So looking from a technology and operations point of view, what might affect people's work in the short and the long term? So someone might say that if this doesn't get done, I will be impacted by my ability to actually creating content for the next 2 weeks. Or it's going to impact the team for the next 6 months. If, for example, you're using the wrong technology or you're updating a software package. So you're looking to openly address what could go wrong and how this will impact the strategy, the people, and the project. So a successful alignment week is when the team's walking away with that shared vision and an understanding of how you're going to be tackling the next milestone. On a more granular level, on the project, we use retros, sit reps, and stand-ups to check in with the teams on an ongoing basis and openly talk about any blockers or concerns that anyone has. So a retrospective is a method from Agile project management, which is what we use internally. And we use it in conjunction with our alignment weeks to look back at what went well and what didn't work. So this gives us an opportunity to reflect on how we can keep improving the process. Then we have sit reps roughly every fortnight to make sure that we understand the progress on the project set for a sprint, everything's on track. In some actions that can be coming out of the sit reps is maybe having to descope something, or we might have to reprioritize something if we realize that it's more important or has less of a priority. Stand-ups are the most granular level of check-ins that we use. They provide a chance for the teams or the individuals to discuss what they're going to do for that day, if they're blocked or if they need any assistance. But also, very importantly, it lets people know that they might need to collaborate or get work done together that day. So I've talked about what we do at League of Geeks, and you probably noticed that we have a lot of processes in place for our project management. Because for us, the consequences of something going wrong can be significant. So if our operation stopped unexpectedly for 3 days, that could be a snowball effect. That means we failed to deliver a milestone for a publisher. But for your own project, you might find that the same risk may have a different impact to you. So is having those plans and process in place going to eliminate all your risk and your exposure? It's not. Things are always going to go wrong. However, it's going to put you in a better place to handle those things if and when they come about. Because again, you can't address risk you haven't identified previously. So that process may mean that you're able to identify problems a lot faster. So as your project unfolds, you may make some unexpected discoveries. Let's say the technical approach plan for your project turns out to be more complex than you expected. Maybe your solution needs to be able to interact with a number of other systems. We could just completely blow out your scope. If you have processes in place where stakeholders are able to talk to each other and flag those concerns as they happen, you can address them a lot quicker. So this is where you have a big advantage when people understand what they're accountable for. So your executive producer may own the delivery of the milestone, but also think about everyone's responsibilities and the role they play in the project. Because each person, or like at any level, will have a different area that they have a level of oversight on. And this is absolutely scalable to your situation. And the brainstorming and the controls you put in place don't have to take as long as you may think, but you may be surprised about some of the insights you can get out of it. On the other hand, if you're a business owner or a director, you'll have an added layer of responsibility given to you by things like legislation, privacy laws, the National Employment Standard if you have employees, and the tax office. So I like to think about operations as making sure the humming of the engine is smooth and stays smooth, and operations risk as broadly the risk that arises from carrying on a business. So you're thinking things like compliance, processes, peoples, and systems. So at no point do you want to have accidentally broken the law because you've crossed a threshold you didn't know about, or you didn't understand your responsibilities. So this is also an area where you should think of what you can control and what you're better off transferring. For example, to a lawyer or to an accountant, which is going to provide you with that insurance that you're not misstepping anywhere and allow you to focus on creating your game. And if you're scaling as well, think of the implications of your growth on your responsibility, because suddenly you may need to be paying new taxes like GST and payroll tax. You'll have some implications around the, hiring employees, your trademarks, or engaging in an investment contract. And so this is where your accountability and knowing who's responsible for what is quite important. So very quickly, I touched on compliance. Some of the things that you might look out for is having an ABN if you're running a business. If you're earning over 75,000 a year, register for GST. If you've got employees, a lot, right? Fair Work Act, OHS, work cover, PAYG contracts, and specifically with the operational health and safety. Something to keep in mind, reminded that we're in the midst of a global pandemic and COVID-19 has the potential to cause serious illness. And you're responsible to the well-being of your staff. So think very hard about asking people to move away from working from home if that's something that you're planning to do. And when you create your COVID safe plan, take it very seriously. Cool, then there's the payroll tax threshold, which is $54,000 a month in payroll. And privacy laws and data security laws, and making sure you've got the right insurance in place. Cool. So some of the tools that we've got at Log to mitigate some of those operational risks. We've got policies and processes. So setting these and make them really clear can be a bit of work. But once you have them in place, it means that everyone's going to be on the same page on how things are done and what's expected of them. And more importantly, this is going to tie in with your culture and your values. And this is why this is quite important, because as you scale, your people issues and those misunderstandings that could come out of them are going to be your biggest maintenance. So an example of a policy that's getting quite a bit of use now for us is a flexible work policy. So that covers things like the rights and responsibilities of individuals when they work from home or if they need flexible hours. Because a policy is well defined, we don't have to deal with the misunderstandings or frustrations from either the team or the people managing them. Something else that we have is the weekly founders meetings. where the heads of the studio get together and have a chance to discuss the project direction, the operations of the business, and whether there's anything long term that we need to plan for. We also have weekly leadership meetings where we can talk again about the project, any blockers at a high level, even like tips on how to manage people and how to lead, which has been really fantastic. We've got monthly finance meetings. So this will be partly with the founders to look at the studio as a whole, but also with the project team so that they've got the visibility of how they're tracking against a budget. And then we have a risk register, and we have a governance timetable. So this is a snippet from our risk register. So we use this one as a formal document to maintain a list of the key risks and events, those consequences, the treatment that we've got in place, the likelihood of something happening, and how big of a consequence it's going to have if it happens. So this is something that the entire leadership team needs to have visibility over, so they can know and understand what events and what risks we're exposed to and how these are controlled. And if any of the leads need to take accountability for any of those risks, they need to know that. So there's a bunch that I've already talked about today, but also we're looking at things like data security. So our tech director is going to be responsible for that. We're looking at the impacts of foreign exchange movement. So that's something that I'll be tracking really closely. If we lose key personnel as well, I mean, that's a huge fear, isn't it? Like if you lose some of your leadership team, or the one person that can do AI in your studio, that's going to be a very big deal. And obviously also the change in technology, which happens a lot. Finally, we have the governance timetable. So effectively, this is going to be a checklist of all the things you should be making sure happens in your business and lining that up to a calendar. So that allows the spread of the governance workload over the year and make sure that you're not forgetting any key events. It's really a cheat sheet for you and your founders to make sure the business keeps running smoothly. So this is a snapshot of what we use at Log. Some of the key things that I've got here is making sure I'm renewing our insurance on time. So that's coming up. How it's gone. Making sure I'm not missing any dates for grants due, and making sure that the founders are checking and reviewing our internal policies to make sure that they're still current and still apply. So strategic risk, as opposed to operational risk, is really about facing those big picture existential questions. And it's the stuff that you're not going to fix in a day or a week. It's the really big things like looking at whether your business is going to be sustainable. So if your game isn't going to be the next indie success or slow on the uptake, are you ready to push through? What's the plan? What's an event that's going to be catastrophic to your operations? How much risk are you prepared to take? Is this the right size of the studio for what you're trying to achieve, or do you need to downsize or upsize? Are the games that you're making the right games to make for you? Is the platform that you're launching on the right platform to be on? So it's that really big stuff that you cannot change overnight, but you can talk about with your business partners and with the rest of your team as well, or even reaching out to people in the industry that may have gone through very similar questions. And think about, where do you want to be and how are you going to do it? And so again, at Log, we have some of these tools. So the Founders Strategy Week So this is where the heads of our studio, Trent, Ty, and Blake, go away to formulate some of the studio objectives long term and do the best to come up with answers to the big existential questions. You know, who is Log? We have the logbook, which talks about our values and our visions for the studio. So this is something that share with the team and that they can align on. We have priorities on a page. So this is self-explanatory. So this aims to make sure that we're taking the small steps needed to move towards our objectives long term. And finally, we make sure that we're networking and connecting to the industry, because of course, no one should feel they're doing it alone. Cool. Let's take a breath here. Moving on. Finance risk. Because we're in it for the craft, but we also need to feed ourselves. So finance risks are the ones that have to do with your money. So the possibility of running out of cash to pay your bills is going to be the exchange rate going into the wrong direction. So obviously, as most of us get our revenue in USD, if the USD becomes weaker, we get less money. So it also has to do with your internal finance systems, making sure you've got the right accounting package. Also thinking about access, so making sure you've got the payment limits, making sure that the people that have access to your bank accounts and ability to make payments are the right people. And having the clear guidelines around who can approve what. So for example, our executive producers can make purchases on their projects, but founders are the only ones who can approve a contract or an asset purchase. So if you're a business owner or director of your studio, you should be across all of those. So again, some of the tools that we've got in place at League of Geeks. We're using budgets and projections. We're tracking our projects individually, so which is, again, very useful if you're working on more than one game or if you've got separate components to your game. Of course, ongoing cash flow management. So a budget is a very important tool. It's going to help you determine if your game is viable and make sure that you've got the means to support yourself and your team until launch and beyond. So you're looking to balance how much it's going to cost you against the revenue it will return or the funding you're receiving. So once you know your unmovable costs, so that will be people costs, if you're paying rent, if you've got licenses that you're subscribing to that you can do without, you can determine how much cash you've got left after that to either save and build up your war chest or reinvest into your project. Some tools that are useful when you're budgeting the dev month. So this is an estimate of the cost of running the project per person employed. And it's very useful for planning long-term when you don't know what all the costs are going to be, but you need to see if you can afford the number of heads it's going to take to complete a project. Then we've got the burn rate. So that's going to be how much it's going to cost to run your studio or your project per month before launch. So this can give you a really good indication of how quickly you will burn through your reserves. And then we use the timing of expenditure. So this will be around planning when those large costs are going to come out. So things like when do you start marketing, or when do you invest in equipment, or invest in a contractor for a specific piece of work. And the timing of expenditure is definitely tied to the cash flow. And finally, we've got scenario analysis. So exploring different possibilities and having a plan B if your source of revenue falls through, or if you have sales that are not as good as you expected. So we do a detailed monthly budgets and projections at least 12 months out. And we also have a high level budget for the full length of a new project to launch. So ideally, when you're building a budget, you do want to have the visibility at least 12 months out, but also maybe at a higher level, at least for the length of the project. So the revenue side, the revenue obviously is going to dictate what you're able to invest in your project. There's some great talks on funding and investment. There's GCAP with some great resources from IGA as well, so I'm not going to cover this here. If you've got existing products, you can use some of your past performance to identify some drivers for revenue. But also, if you've done some market analysis, you can probably look at things like what impact does marketing have on your sales, or streaming, or releasing an update, or having sales on, or creating bundles, or what seasonality has an impact as well. Obviously, around Christmas, we see a huge amount of sale. So the more detail you're willing to go into, more analysis you're willing to get into, you can probably get closer projections. But there'll always be a margin for error because you're using the past information to try and predict the future performance. And as we know, things change rapidly. And finally, if you're trying to calculate revenue for a game that hasn't launched yet, you can do some market analysis and you can do some estimates, but at the end of the day, there's really no telling how it's going to perform. So the best you can do is an educated guess. So, project cost tracking. First and foremost, I'm an accountant. So I'm seeing firsthand how having that financial information and having that data and putting it in a structured way can feed your strategy and feed your decision making. So if you have multiple projects in-house, or even if you're building content that's monetized, allocating the cost and matching to that corresponding revenue is going to allow you to see if you're spending your resources most efficiently. And you can do that by using the project category in your accounting system and making sure you're coding both the revenue and the expenditure to the project that they relate to. An example here that I've got, so these are made up numbers. They're not one of our projects. So if we, in this example, if we invested more in game 2, yeah, that's also translated in more sales and a better return than game 1. So perhaps the intelligence that we got from that is that the more we invest in making something, the better quality it is, and the more revenue is going to bring us and the better return it's going to have. We can also see that in-game store sales bring a pretty modest revenue compared to the actual games, but the cost to produce that content is actually very low. So that means that you get a great return. So this is giving you a really powerful insight on where your time is best spent or how a project is performing. And you can also think of the break-even point. So this is how many sales you need to make before your project becomes profitable. So if you determine the cost to launch a project, I've lost myself. So if you determine the cost to launch a project, but the revenue you need to make to recoup those costs are not realistic. So for example, going back to the revenue projections and the market analysis, then you might be thinking twice before going ahead. Or maybe you're going to make the educated decision to go ahead anyway if the objective of that project is not necessarily to make a profit. Cash flow. When you're building cash flow, you want to be breaking out all of the revenue and all of the expenditure by month as close as possible to when they're likely to happen. For revenue, obviously something to keep in mind is that most platforms only distribute your royalties 30 to 60 days after the end of the month. And on the expenditure side, you're going to be affected by things like your GST and all the payments you need to make to the ATO. You'll notice here I've also set a minimum balance, and here it's simply the expenses for the next month. But this could also be the total cost if you need to close your studio tomorrow, or it could be just a number that you're safe with, knowing that your bank balance never goes below that number. And this is where you start seeing the visual representation of that table I just showed you. So what you notice is that because of the lower sales that you anticipate between April and September, without changing anything about your costs, you're using up your savings, and you're using up that war chest that you've built up, and your cash flow is dropping. Something I'll bring to your attention here is that your bank balance doesn't actually fall below zero, and that can give you a false sense of security. So this is where the minimum bank balance comes in. It's going to flag you if you may have some trouble paying your bills in a coming month. For example, in September here, we've fallen below the minimum balance threshold, but we still expect to have $1,000 in the bank by the end of the month. And the problem that this is possibly highlighting is that there could be a week there where you may go into a negative bank balance because the bills in October might come in at the very start of the month. So you might have $2,000 worth of bills that you need to pay, but the revenue is only coming at the end of the month. So some of the actions that you might be seeing from going through this process is, if you know you're going to have leaner months, think about the sales that you can get into, or whether you can generate more revenue through features or through game strategy. Think if there's any bills you can hold off paying for a month or two to safeguard that cash flow. Know when your taxes are due, and if you know your cash flow may be at risk far enough in advance, there's a lot that you can do before it becomes a problem. So at League of Geeks, we've personally been in this situation before, where the cash balance looked fine at the end of the month, but the bills and the revenue didn't quite line up, and we just had to manage that at the last minute. So now the minimum cash balance is something that we're always tracking, and it's something that we're always using to make decisions on resourcing and hiring, and when to make those big purchases and big investments. Some takeaways? Cash is what keeps you going. And I don't mean this in an existential sense. There's bills that we need to pay. So understand where you may be exposed. Make sure you've got the strong safeguards in your bank accounts. Definitely get advice from your accountants on your obligations and best practices, and know where there's going to be costs that are going to blow out potentially. And also use all the data that you have available. You can get great big insights from where your revenue is coming from, and use that to drive your focus and drive your investment. So circling back to our risk framework here, and how that can have those practical implications for you. So your goals, whether that's for your studio or your milestone or for a sprint, I can't stress enough how important it is to understand what success is going to look like for you. Because this will define your entire operations and the significance of each risk that you faced with. And thinking of the internal and external forces impacting your studio or your team, it's going to give you an idea of the risks that you're exposed to. And again, look at those categories that I've talked about around external and project, operations, strategy, and finance risk. And think of the impact being how likely it is and how hard it will hit you. So gathering all of that information is not a cause to panic. Remember that the more you know about what could go wrong, the more power you have to control the outcome. So I've talked about some of the questions you can ask to brainstorm, and those are prompts that you're going to use with your project leads and your stakeholders, and definitely get those insights and assistance from the people in the industry. Have a treatment plan. So that's where you can start planning how you mitigate that risk, whether that's through processes you put in place, or for some operation risk, transfer that responsibility to a lawyer or an accountant. And your risk plan can be as granular or high level as you need it to match your individual circumstances. And finally, keep reviewing how you're tracking and if you need to adjust those plans. So the nature of game development is that things change very rapidly, and you often will find yourself having to add, delete, or reprioritize features, which may change your risk profile, and start the process again of reviewing your risk and reviewing your impacts and planning how you're going to control that new risk. It's a constant ongoing process. So maybe you'll create a risk register, like I've shown you that we have at Log, or maybe you'll operate better with something less regimented. But I do think that having something documented is going to encourage the conversation and is going to encourage action. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found some useful tips from this talk. I'm Olga Vassilieva from League of Geeks. Thank you.